He was a titan of industry, a man who bought and sold empires between appetizers, his net worth eclipsing the GDP of small nations. She was the woman pouring his water, a ghost in a crisp apron, invisible, insignificant. Or so he thought. In the hushed, velvet-draped elegance of London's most exclusive restaurant, he decided to test his foreign business partners with a volley of Russian, a language he was certain no one else at the table, let alone the room, would understand. He made a cruel, dismissive joke at his waitress's expense. What he never expected was for her to answer back flawlessly, turning his power play into a public humiliation that would change both of their lives forever. The air in Ethelgard's was thick with the scent of money and roasted duck. It was a fragrance Clara Vance had come to know intimately over the past 3 years, a heavy, cloying perfume that clung to the velvet curtains and settled deep into the grain of the mahogany tables. It smelled of legacy, of deals struck over 100-year-old cognac, of a world so far removed from her own that serving it felt like peering through the wrong end of a telescope. Clara moved with an economy of motion that bordered on invisibility. A refilled water glass here, a crumb swept away with a silver tool there. Her uniform, a stark black dress with a starched white apron, was a cloak of anonymity. To the patrons of Ethelgard's, she was not Clara Vance, the woman who once debated the etymological roots of Proto-Indo-European verbs with esteemed professors at Oxford. She was not the daughter who had held her father's hand as his construction empire crumbled under the weight of his medical bills. She was simply the girl, a pair of hands, a fleeting presence. Tonight, the Solstice Chamber, the most private and opulent of Ethelgard's dining rooms, was occupied. The reservation was under a single name that had sent a ripple of anxiety through the staff. Blackwood. Sterling Blackwood was not just wealthy. He was a force of nature, a predator in a bespoke suit. His photograph was a regular feature in financial magazines, always with the same cold, calculating gaze. He was a self-made monster of the tech and logistics world, having clawed his way up from nothing with a ruthlessness that was legendary. He was known for his brutal negotiations and his utter contempt for anyone he deemed beneath him, a category that, in his view, included almost everyone. Clara felt the familiar knot tighten in her stomach as she prepared the room. She polished the baccarat crystal glasses until they were transparent slivers of light. She aligned the heavy silverware with obsessive precision. Every detail had to be perfect. With a client like Sterling Blackwood, a single fork tine out of place could feel like a personal insult, and his displeasure was not something to be courted. He arrived precisely at 8, flanked by 3 other men. Blackwood was taller than his photos suggested, with a severe, angular face and hair the color of polished steel. He moved with a coiled energy, a barely contained impatience, as if the very act of walking was a waste of his valuable time. He didn't acknowledge Clara, his gaze sweeping over her and the room as if she were just another fixture, a lamp or a chair. The other men were a study in deference. 2 of them, sleek and nervous, were clearly his own subordinates, their eyes constantly flicking to their boss for approval. The 3rd man was different. He was older, with a broad Slavic face and a heavy, expensive overcoat. He carried himself with a quiet authority that suggested he was not an employee. This must be the partner, the reason for this high-stakes dinner. The Solstice Chamber. Blackwood announced, his voice a low baritone that seemed to absorb sound. Acceptable. It was the highest praise anyone could expect. Clara stepped forward. Good evening, gentlemen. My name is Clara, and I will be your server tonight. May I take your coats? Blackwood was already shrugging out of his cashmere coat and handing it toward her without making eye contact. The other men followed suit. The older gentleman met her eyes for a brief moment and gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. His name, according to the reservation notes, was Anton Petrov, a key figure in a massive Eurasian energy conglomerate. We will begin with a bottle of the 98 Petrus. Blackwood commanded, not looking at the wine list. And still water for the table. No ice. Of course, Mr. Blackwood. Clara replied, her voice a placid, professional murmur. As she turned to leave, she caught the beginning of their conversation. Blackwood had switched languages. The shift was instantaneous, the hard consonants and flowing vowels of Russian filling the small room. Clara paused for a fraction of a second outside the door, a phantom limb of her old life twitching. She had spent a year on an exchange in St. Petersburg, immersing herself in Dostoevsky and the complex grammar that felt like poetry to her. She understood every word. Blackwood was speaking to Petrov. "Anton, my friend, thank you for coming. I trust your flight was comfortable." Petrov replied in equally fluent Russian. "Sterling. It was as comfortable as one can be in a metal tube for 9 hours. Let us hope this conversation is more productive." Clara continued down the hall to the wine cellar, the familiar cadence of the language echoing in her mind. It was a bittersweet symphony. For 3 years she had suppressed that part of herself. The languages she held in her mind, Russian, German, Icelandic, Mandarin, and a functional grasp of a half-dozen others, were like magnificent dormant birds, trapped in a cage of necessity. They were useless here. Here her only required language was deference. She returned with the wine, presenting it to Blackwood, with the practiced grace of a seasoned sommelier. He gave it a cursory glance and a curt nod. She opened the bottle, the pop of the cork, a soft, respectful punctuation mark in their Russian conversation. As she poured the deep ruby liquid, she couldn't help but overhear. They were discussing shipping routes, port access, and the complex geopolitics of a new pipeline. Blackwood was aggressive, laying out his terms with the blunt force of a battering ram. Petrov was more measured, a seasoned chess player, countering each move with quiet, unyielding logic. Clara moved around the table, topping up water glasses. She was a ghost again, her mind simultaneously translating their intricate dance of commerce while her body performed the simple, repetitive tasks of her job. It was a strange, disembodying experience. She knew more than Blackwood's 2 subordinates, who were nodding along with blank, uncomprehending expressions. She understood the nuance, the veiled threats, the subtle shifts in leverage. As she placed a bread basket on the table, Blackwood gestured impatiently with his hand, nearly knocking it from her grasp. "Water," he said in English, the single word a sharp, dismissive command. "Of course, sir," she said, reaching for the water decanter. She moved to his side, her arm steady as she poured. Her proximity made him uncomfortable. He shifted slightly, an almost imperceptible flinch of a man who loathed the intrusion of service staff into his personal space. And it was then, as she was leaning over, focused on the task, that he turned to Petrov and decided to use her as a conversational prop. Speaking in Russian, his voice laced with a casual, biting arrogance, he said, "You see, Anton, this is the problem with this country. No ambition. Look at this girl. Pretty enough, I suppose, but utterly vacant. Destined to spend her life carrying plates for men like us. Tell her to bring more bread, will you? And to try not to breathe so loudly while she does it. The simple-minded are often noisy." A cold, silent fury washed over Clara. It was not the insult itself she had endured, countless small indignities in this job. It was the casual cruelty of it, the assumption of her ignorance, the way he used a language he believed was a secret code to dehumanize her right to her face. His 2 associates snickered softly. Anton Petrov, however, didn't smile. His gaze flicked from Blackwood to Clara, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. Clara finished pouring the water. She placed the decanter back on the table with a soft, deliberate click. The sound seemed to hang in the air. For a single stretched-out second, she stood perfectly still, the entire weight of her past life, of her suppressed intellect, of her burning indignation pressing down on her. She could say nothing. She could walk away, swallow the bitter bile of his contempt, and bring him his damned bread. That was her job. That was the smart thing to do. But in that moment, 3 years of silent submission shattered. The caged birds in her mind began to sing a defiant, furious song. She straightened her back, turned her head slightly, and looked not at Blackwood, but directly at Mr. Petrov. And then, in perfectly enunciated formal Russian, her voice calm and clear as a winter morning, she spoke. "My apologies, Mr. Petrov. Mr. Blackwood would like more bread. I will bring it immediately. And I will endeavor to breathe more quietly, so that my simple mind does not disturb your important negotiations." The effect was instantaneous and profound. The room, which had been filled with the low murmur of high-stakes business, fell into a silence so absolute it felt like a physical pressure. Blackwood's 2 subordinates froze, their sycophantic smirks wiped clean from their faces, replaced by slack-jawed disbelief. They stared at Clara as if she had just sprouted a second head. Their gazes darted nervously between her and their boss, uncertain of the proper reaction. Anton Petrov's reaction was more controlled, but no less dramatic. His eyebrows shot up toward his hairline, and a slow, genuine smile spread across his broad face. He leaned back in his chair, a low chuckle rumbling in his chest. He looked at Clara not with surprise, but with something akin to delight, as if he had just discovered a rare gem in a pile of gravel. But it was Sterling Blackwood's reaction that Clara watched most intently. For a long second, he didn't move. He simply stared his fork halfway to his mouth. The cogs were turning behind his cold grey eyes, processing the impossible. First came confusion, then dawning comprehension, followed by a dark, rising tide of fury. A dull red flush crept up from the collar of his pristine white shirt, suffusing his neck and cheeks. It was the unmistakable color of pure, undiluted humiliation. He had been unmasked. In front of a critical business partner, in front of his own employees, his arrogance had been turned back on him like a perfectly polished mirror. He had tried to use his knowledge as a weapon, a tool of exclusion and superiority, and the invisible girl had not only deflected the blow, but had caught the blade and held it to his throat. Clara held his gaze for a moment longer. There was no triumph in her eyes, no smugness. There was only a quiet, unyielding dignity. She had not shouted or created a scene. She had simply stated the facts of his own rudeness back to him in his chosen language. The power of her response lay in its utter tranquility. Without another word, she gave a slight formal bow of her head towards Petrov, turned on her heel, and walked out of the solstice chamber, her back ramrod straight. The moment the door clicked shut behind her, the silence in the dining room was broken. She could hear Petrov's hearty laugh, a genuine booming sound that was utterly at odds with the tense atmosphere of moments before. "Well, Sterling," Petrov exclaimed, his voice carrying clearly through the thick wood. "It seems the staff at Ethelgard's is more qualified than you assumed. A simple mind, I think, not she, has better diction than my own nephew in Moscow." Clara leaned against the cool wall in the service corridor, her heart hammering against her ribs. Adrenaline coursed through her veins, a volatile cocktail of fear and exhilarating vindication. Her hands were shaking slightly. What had she just done? She had just committed career suicide. You did not embarrass a man like Sterling Blackwood and expect to keep your job. The best she could hope for was to be fired on the spot. The worst, well, a man with his resources could make her life difficult in ways she didn't want to imagine. Her manager, a perpetually stressed man named Geoffrey, came bustling down the hallway. Clara. What's happening in there? Is everything all right? Mr. Blackwood's assistant just called the front desk asking who the waitress in the solstice chamber is. Clara took a deep breath, steadying herself. There was a linguistic misunderstanding, Geoffrey. A what? He asked, his brow furrowed in confusion. Mr. Blackwood made a comment in Russian. He assumed I wouldn't understand. I responded. Geoffrey's face went pale. You spoke to him? In Russian? He looked at her, as if she'd confessed to setting fire to the curtains. Clara, you know the rules. No unnecessary conversation with the guests, especially not with him. What did you say? I merely translated his request for more bread. Geoffrey, she said, the understatement hanging in the air. Before Geoffrey could fully process the impending disaster, the door to the solstice chamber opened. It wasn't one of the subordinates. It was Sterling Blackwood himself. He stood in the doorway, his face a thunderous mask. He ignored Geoffrey completely, his piercing gaze locked onto Clara. You, he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. My office, tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock sharp. He pulled a sleek black business card from his jacket and thrust it at her. Don't be late. He didn't wait for a reply. He turned and went back into the room, slamming the door with a force that rattled the wine glasses on a nearby service cart. Geoffrey stared at the closed door, then at Clara, then at the business card in her hand. His office, Blackwood Capital. Clara, what in God's name did you do? Clara looked down at the card. The embossed silver lettering seemed to shimmer under the dim hallway light. Sterling Blackwood, CEO, Blackwood Capital. An address in the Shard, London's glittering monument to modern wealth and power. She hadn't been fired. Not yet, anyway. She had been summoned. A shiver of apprehension, mixed with a strange, defiant curiosity, ran through her. The game had just changed. Sterling Blackwood wasn't content with firing her. He wanted to confront her on his own turf, where the power dynamic was firmly, unassailably in his favor. She met Geoffrey's panicked gaze. I believe, she said, her voice regaining its composure. I have a meeting to prepare for. Back inside the solstice chamber, the mood had irrevocably shifted. The business talk had ceased. Blackwood sat in stony silence, his jaw clenched. His two assistants avoided his gaze, studying their water glasses, as if they held the secrets of the universe. It was Anton Petrov who finally spoke, a twinkle of amusement still in his eyes. You should hire that girl Sterling, he said, swirling the Petrus in his glass. Anyone who can handle you with that much grace and a dagger-sharp tongue is worth her weight in gold. She didn't just understand the language, she understood the nuance, the power of it. That is a rare skill. Blackwood finally looked up, his eyes like chips of flint. Don't be absurd, Anton. She's a waitress. Is she? Petrov countered, taking a slow sip of wine. Or is that just the uniform you see? I saw a strategist. You tried to put her in her place, and she put you in yours without raising her voice or breaking protocol. That wasn't an outburst. It was a countermove, a brilliant one. Now about those port tariffs. Petrov smoothly steered the conversation back to business, but the point had been made. The seed was planted. Sterling Blackwood, a man who prided himself on recognizing and acquiring assets, had been forced to look at the invisible girl and see something else entirely. He saw an anomaly, an unexpected variable he couldn't categorize, and Sterling Blackwood did not tolerate variables. He conquered them. The next morning, London was draped in a fine, persistent drizzle that blurred the edges of the city into a watercolor of grey and silver. Clara stood at the base of the Shard, craning her neck to look up at the colossal spire of glass and steel as it pierced the low-hanging clouds. It was a building that didn't just occupy space, it dominated it, a monument to the very power and ambition she was about to confront. Her Ethelgard's uniform was gone, replaced by the best and only professional outfit. She owned a simple, well-tailored navy blue dress, her dark hair pulled back into a severe, elegant bun. It was her armor. The lobby of Blackwood Capital was a cathedral of minimalist wealth. White marble floors gleamed under recessed lighting, and the only splashes of color were a massive abstract painting that probably cost more than her father's entire lost company, and the vibrant blue of the digital stock ticker flowing silently along one wall. The air was cool, sterile, and smelled faintly of ozone and ambition. "Clara Vance for Mr. Blackwood," she announced to the receptionist who sat behind a desk that looked like a giant polished piece of obsidian. The receptionist, a woman with unnervingly perfect hair and a synthetic smile, tapped at her keyboard. "He is expecting you. 78th floor. Please take the express elevator on your right." The elevator ride was a silent, stomach-lurching ascent. As the cab rocketed upwards, the sprawling, rain-slicked panorama of London unfolded below her. It felt like leaving the real world behind and ascending to the realm of the gods, or in this case, the demigods of finance. The 78th floor was even more starkly opulent than the lobby. It was an open-plan expanse of glass and chrome with panoramic views that made the city look like a toy model. A severe-looking woman with a headset and a clipboard, Blackwood's executive assistant, intercepted her the moment the elevator doors opened. "Miss Vance, this way." She led Clara through the hushed office space, past desks, where impeccably dressed young men and women typed with silent, focused intensity. No one looked up. It was a realm of absolute, disciplined focus. The assistant stopped before a pair of towering glass doors. "Mr. Blackwood will see you now." Clara took a deep breath and pushed the door open. Sterling Blackwood's office was less a workspace and more a command center. It occupied the corner of the building with 2 entire walls of floor-to-ceiling glass, offering a breathtaking 180-degree view of London. The desk was a slab of polished black granite, utterly devoid of clutter, save for a sleek monitor and a single minimalist phone. Blackwood wasn't sitting behind it. He was standing by the window, his back to her, looking down at the city he had in many ways conquered. "Miss Vance," he said, without turning around. His voice was calm, controlled, a stark contrast to the barely contained rage of the night before. "Punctual. I appreciate that. Punctuality is the courtesy of kings and a necessity for everyone else." He turned slowly. He was dressed in a razor-sharp grey suit, the picture of corporate power. His face was an unreadable mask. "Please sit," he said, gesturing to one of 2 severe leather chairs positioned in front of his desk. They were clearly designed to be uncomfortable, to place visitors at a distinct psychological disadvantage. Clara sat her back straight, her hands folded calmly in her lap. She would not be intimidated. Blackwood walked around his desk and sat opposite her, leaning forward slightly, his hand steepled on the granite surface. He studied her for a long, silent moment, his grey eyes analytical, as if he were trying to solve a complex equation. "Last night," he began, his voice dropping to a lower register, "you took a considerable risk." I responded to a direct comment, "Mr. Blackwood." Clara replied, her tone even. It seemed the courteous thing to do. A flicker of something annoyance respect crossed his face. Courteous. An interesting choice of word. Most people in your position would have chosen foolish or insubordinate. Most people in my position are not former candidates for a linguistics doctorate at Oxford University, specializing in contractual and diplomatic syntax. The words left her lips before she had consciously decided to say them. The moment they were out, she knew there was no going back. She had laid her cards on the table. Blackwood leaned back, a single eyebrow raised. The mask had cracked. This finally had surprised him. Oxford, he repeated slowly. So the question is not how you speak Russian. The question is why a doctoral candidate from Oxford is pouring wine at Ethelgard's. Life is not always a linear progression, Mr. Blackwood. Clara said, her voice tight. My father became ill. His business failed. I left my program to take care of him and to pay off the debts. Ethelgard's offered a steady paycheck and demanded very little in the way of intellectual investment. It was a practical choice. He nodded slowly, processing the information. The narrative was beginning to make sense to him. He was a man who understood systems, and Clara had been a disruptive element because she didn't fit the system he had placed her in. Now he could see the outlines of a new one. I see, he said. So your performance last night was not merely an act of defiance, it was a demonstration of a wasted asset. I wasn't demonstrating anything, sir. I was defending my dignity. Dignity is a luxury. He countered, his voice sharp again. Assets are a reality. You have an asset, and it is currently being wasted, serving overpriced sea bass to hedge fund managers. He paused, his gaze intensifying. The deal with Anton Petrov is worth $900 million to my company. It hinges on navigating a labyrinth of international regulations, trilingual contracts, and the cultural sensitivities of our partners. Petrov was impressed by you. He found your counter-move, as he called it, to be a mark of character and skill. Clara remained silent, her expression neutral. She was beginning to see where this was going. I am a pragmatist, Ms. Vance, Blackwood continued. I do not care about your dignity, your past, or your feelings. I care about results. Last night, in humiliating me, you inadvertently made my position stronger. You showed my partner that my organization down to the most seemingly insignificant level possesses unexpected depth. A foolish man would fire you. A smart man would find a way to use you. He leaned forward again, his eyes locking onto hers. The predator was back. I am offering you a position, a 6-month probationary contract as a linguistic consultant for the Petrov deal. You will review documents, attend meetings, and provide real-time analysis of negotiations. You will report directly to me. He named a salary that made Clara's breath catch in her throat. It was more than she would make in a decade at Ethelgard's. It was enough to settle the last of her father's debts and start a new life. It was a golden ladder out of the hole she had been stuck in for 3 long years. It was also a deal with the devil. She would be working for the man who had casually and cruelly insulted her, a man who represented everything she disdained about the world of wealth and power. He wasn't offering her a job out of kindness or respect. He was buying her skill. He was acquiring an asset. She looked out the window at the city spread below a vast, intricate map of possibilities. For 3 years, her world had been the 20-foot radius around her serving station. He was offering her a view from the top of the world. But at what cost to her soul? You find my offer unsatisfactory, he prompted, misinterpreting her silence as a negotiation tactic. Clara brought her gaze back to him. The offer is generous. But I have a question. Ask. Last night you insulted me because you believed I was beneath you. You saw the uniform, not the person. If I accept, I will be wearing a different uniform, a suit instead of an apron. What will you see then, Mr. Blackwood? A colleague or just a more expensive servant? Sterling Blackwood was taken aback. No one spoke to him like this. His employees feared him. His rivals respected his power. No one questioned his character to his face. For a moment, she thought he would rescind the offer, throw her out of his office. Instead, a slow, cold smile touched his lips. It did not reach his eyes. Ms. Vance, he said, I will see an asset I have paid a great deal for, and I will expect it to perform. Nothing more, nothing less. The honesty was brutal, but it was honest. He wasn't pretending to be a changed man. He was a shark, and he was telling her plainly that he was a shark. It was up to her if she wanted to swim in his ocean. "One more thing," Clara said, her courage solidifying. "You're wrong about dignity. It isn't a luxury. It's the one thing that can't be bought or sold. And I will not compromise it." Blackwood's smile widened slightly. "We'll see," he said. "Human Resources is on the 75th floor. They will have your contract ready. I expect you here tomorrow at 8. The audience was over. Clara's first week at Blackwood Capital was a baptism by fire. She was given a sterile glass-walled office not far from Blackwood's own, a space that was simultaneously prestigious and isolating. She spent the first few days buried under a mountain of documents, contracts, feasibility studies, geological surveys, and political risk assessments, all related to the Petrov deal. The core of the project involved securing exclusive shipping rights through certain Arctic passages, a venture that required not just the cooperation of Petrov's Russian conglomerate, but also navigating the treacherous legal waters of Iceland's maritime authorities. The documents were a dense thicket of legalese written in English-Russian, and to Clara's surprise, Icelandic. It was here that she began to see the true complexity of the challenge. Icelandic, with its ancient grammar and resistance to foreign loanwords, was a minefield of nuance. A single misplaced case ending or a poorly chosen verb could alter the entire meaning of a clause, shifting millions of dollars of liability from one party to another. Sterling Blackwood was a demanding, omnipresent force. He communicated in clipped impersonal emails and summoned her to his office with a single sharp buzz of the intercom. He never mentioned the incident at Ethelgard's. To him, it was ancient history, the moment of acquisition. Now she was an asset, and he drove his assets hard. He would question her on obscure points of Russian syntax, test her knowledge of Icelandic maritime law, and demand instant translations of complex technical documents. Clara met his demands with a cool, unflappable professionalism. The work was exhilarating. The dormant parts of her brain, the ones that had languished while calculating tips and memorizing wine pairings, roared back to life. She felt alive, sharp her mind, a finely tuned instrument once again. She was no longer just a waitress. She was a linguist, a strategist, rediscovering the power of her own intellect. The first major test came 10 days after she started. Blackwood called a meeting with the Icelandic contingent, a team of lawyers and negotiators from Reykjavik. The meeting was held in the main boardroom, a cavernous space dominated by a 20-foot-long black marble table and a panoramic view of the London Eye. Clara was seated not at the main table, but in a chair set slightly back beside Blackwood's 2 assistants, from that first night the ones who had snickered at his joke. Their names were Richard and Thomas, and they now treated her with a mixture of fear and bewildered respect. Her role was clear. She was to be a silent observer, a living translation machine for Blackwood to deploy as needed. The Icelanders were led by a man named Gunnar Gunnarsson, a formidable figure with a thick white beard and eyes the color of a stormy North Atlantic sea. He and his team were polite but unyielding. The negotiations, conducted primarily in English, quickly stalled on a key clause regarding liability in the event of an environmental incident. Gunnarsson was adamant. "Mr. Blackwood, the language of Clause 17b is unacceptable. Best efforts is too vague. We require a commitment to guaranteed remediation, regardless of fault." Blackwood pushed back his voice, smooth and reasonable, but with an underlying edge of steel. "Mr. Gunnarsson, a guaranteed remediation clause creates an unacceptable level of open-ended financial exposure. Best efforts is standard language in agreements of this nature." For an hour, they went back and forth, the lawyers on both sides, parsing every word. Clara listened, her focus absolute. She wasn't just listening to the English. She was observing their body language, the way they conferred with each other in rapid, low-spoken Icelandic. Then Gunnarsson switched tactics. He turned to his lead counsel and, in his native tongue, began a rapid-fire discussion. He clearly assumed no one on Blackwood's side would understand. "He is a shark," Gunnarsson said, gesturing subtly at Blackwood. "He will not move on this. Let's offer the alternative phrasing from the Akureyri proposal, the one using appropriate measures. It sounds stronger than best efforts, but the legal precedent is on our side. It gives us an escape route if a third party is at fault." His counsel nodded. "A good strategy. He will see it as a concession, but we retain the advantage. The ambiguity of vide Gandhi is our shield." Clara felt a jolt. Appropriate measures. The literal translation was appropriate measures. To an English speaker, it sounded like a reasonable compromise, perhaps even stronger than best efforts. But she knew from her deep dive into Icelandic legal precedent that Gunnarsson was right. The term was notoriously slippery. In a court case 2 years prior involving a fishing dispute, the Icelandic Supreme Court had ruled that appropriate was context-dependent and did not imply exhaustive action. It was a beautifully constructed linguistic trap. Gunnarsson turned back to Blackwood, his expression one of magnanimous compromise. "Mr. Blackwood, in the spirit of partnership, we are prepared to offer a concession. We will withdraw our demand for guaranteed remediation. Instead, we propose the clause state that Blackwood Capital will take all appropriate measures to rectify any environmental damage." Blackwood's lawyers looked at each other relieved. One of them leaned over and whispered to Blackwood, "That's a significant concession. Appropriate measures is much stronger footing for us than best efforts. I'd advise we accept." Blackwood looked at the Icelanders, a triumphant glint in his eye. He was about to agree. He opened his mouth to speak. It was in that split second that Clara knew she had to intervene. It was a massive risk. She was the silent observer, the human dictionary. To speak out to interrupt her boss in the middle of a critical negotiation was unthinkable. It was a direct challenge to his authority, far more egregious than her response at the restaurant. But she also knew that if she stayed silent, the company would be walking into a multi-million-dollar trap, all because of the subtle shadings of a single adjective. Her contractual duty was to provide linguistic analysis, and this was the most critical analysis she could possibly offer. She stood up. The room fell silent. Every eye turned to her. Blackwood's 2 assistants stared in horror. Gunnarsson and his team looked at her with blank confusion. Sterling Blackwood turned his head slowly, his eyes narrowing into dangerous slits. His expression was not just angry, it was lethal. The unspoken message was clear. This had better be the most important thing you have ever said in your life. "Mr. Blackwood." Clara said, her voice clear and strong, projecting across the vast table. "May I have a word?" The silence in the boardroom was absolute. It was the heavy, loaded silence of a high-stakes poker game after an unexpected all-in bet. Gunnarsson and his team exchanged wary glances, their carefully constructed trap now exposed to the light. Blackwood's lawyers looked utterly bewildered. Sterling Blackwood's gaze was glacial. He didn't speak. He simply gestured with a flick of his wrist, a curt, imperious command for her to approach. Clara walked the length of the table, her footsteps echoing softly on the marble floor. She felt like she was walking a tightrope over a canyon. She stopped beside his chair and leaned down, keeping her voice low enough so that only he and his immediate legal counsel could hear. "Sir," she began, her tone formal and devoid of panic. "The term Mr. Gunnarsson has proposed, appropriate measures, is not a concession. It is a calculated legal maneuver." Blackwood's lawyer, a senior partner named Harrison, scoffed quietly. "With all due respect, appropriate is a much stronger legal term for us than best efforts. It implies a standard of objective reasonable—" "No, it doesn't," Clara interrupted, her voice firm but respectful. "Not in this context, not in an Icelandic court. I reviewed the 2023 ruling in a case between the state of Iceland and a fishing company. The Icelandic Supreme Court established a precedent that the definition of appropriate is highly subjective and conditional upon circumstance. It specifically does not create an obligation for exhaustive action. It's weaker than best efforts, because best efforts implies a continuous active process. Appropriate measures could be interpreted as a single, minimal action deemed sufficient at the time." She paused, letting the information sink in. They were just discussing it in Icelandic. They referred to it as an escape route. They believe you see it as a concession, when in fact it transfers the bulk of the long-term liability back to us. Harrison stared at her, his mouth slightly agape. He had been outmaneuvered not by the opposing counsel, but by a linguistic nuance he couldn't possibly have been expected to know. Blackwood's expression was unreadable, but a muscle twitched in his jaw. He had been seconds away from walking into the trap. He had been saved from his own victory, and he had been saved by her. The irony was not lost on him. He sat back in his chair, the picture of calm authority. He had processed the information, analyzed the new strategic landscape, and formulated a counterattack in the space of about 5 seconds. He turned his attention back to Gunnarsson, who was watching him with a carefully neutral expression. "Mr. Gunnarsson," Blackwood said, his voice dangerously smooth. "My apologies for the interruption." "My internal consultant." He nodded briefly in Clara's direction, giving her the title publicly for the first time, was just reminding me of that interesting legal precedent from the 2023 case involving the interpretation of a key regulatory term. The color drained from Gunnarsson's face. His team shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The trap had been sprung, but the jaws had snapped shut on thin air. They were exposed. Blackwood smiled, a cold, predatory baring of teeth. "A clever gambit. I appreciate a worthy opponent. However, we will not be accepting your concession. Let's return to the original wording of Clause 17 IB. Or perhaps," he let the word hang in the air, "you'd be willing to discuss the freight tariffs in Appendix C with a new spirit of flexibility." He had turned their failed gambit into leverage. He had them on the back foot, and he was pressing his advantage mercilessly. The entire dynamic of the negotiation had shifted on the blade of a single word. Gunnarsson, a seasoned negotiator, recovered quickly. He gave a short, sharp laugh, a sound of grudging respect. "You have an excellent team, Mr. Blackwood. Very thorough." His eyes flicked to Clara, a new understanding in his gaze. He nodded at her. "Very thorough indeed." The rest of the negotiation was a foregone conclusion. Blackwood, armed with the knowledge of their deception, systematically dismantled their positions, winning concessions on 3 other key points. By the time the meeting concluded 2 hours later, Blackwood Capital had not just secured the deal, they had secured it on terms far more favorable than they had thought possible that morning. As the Icelanders packed their briefcases and left offering stiff, formal handshakes, Blackwood remained seated at the head of the table. His lawyers and assistants quietly filed out, sensing he wanted the room cleared. Soon only he and Clara remained. The silence returned, but this time it was different. It was not tense, but thoughtful. Blackwood stared out the window at the sprawling city below. "In my world, Miss Vance," he said finally, still not looking at her, "information is the only currency that matters. More than money, more than power. Because it is the source of both. Today, you provided information. that saved this company tens of millions of dollars. Possibly more. He turned to face her. The cold, analytical mask was gone. For the first time, she saw something else in his eyes. It wasn't warmth, not exactly. It was a profound, almost startling glimmer of respect, the kind one warrior gives to another after a battle. At the restaurant, he said, his voice quiet, I saw a uniform. In my office, I saw an asset. Today I saw a weapon. And I have you pointed at my enemies. It's a formidable feeling. He stood up and walked over to the window. That Oxford education. It wasn't wasted, after all. You just needed a different battlefield. He turned back to her. The probationary period on your contract is over. As of this moment, you are head of linguistic strategy for Blackwood Capital. Your salary is doubled. You will have a permanent seat at this table for all future international negotiations. My assistant will have the new contract for you by the end of the day. Clara was stunned into silence. Head of linguistic strategy, a title he had just invented for her. A permanent seat at the table. It was more than she could have imagined. She had done more than just prove her worth. She had carved out a new place for herself in this unforgiving citadel of glass, a position built not on deference, but on undeniable skill. "Thank you, Mr. Blackwood," she managed to say. "Don't thank me," he replied, his voice returning to its usual clipped tone. "You earned it. Now I need a full breakdown of the Mandarin dialects spoken by the board of the Shanghai Port Authority. I want it on my desk by morning." The moment of connection was over. He was back to business. But everything had changed. He had given her a title, a salary, a position of power. But more than that, he had finally given her something she had not even realized she was fighting for. He saw her. Not the waitress, not the asset. He saw Clara Vance. And in his world, that was the ultimate sign of respect. The news of Clara's meteoric rise from consultant to a newly created department head sent quiet shockwaves through the 78th floor. At Blackwood, Capital promotions were earned through years of brutal hours, savage internal competition, and unwavering loyalty. Clara had achieved it in less than 2 weeks. She went from being the mysterious woman in the glass office to a figure of intense curiosity and speculation. Her new role was both demanding and liberating. The title, Head of Linguistic Strategy, was more than just a nameplate on her door. It was a mandate. Blackwood began to include her in the earliest stages of potential deals. Before the lawyers were brought in, before the financial models were built, he would call her into his office. He would point to a map, name a company in Seoul, a government ministry in Ankara, or a tech startup in Helsinki, and ask a single question. What's the linguistic landscape? Where are the traps? Where is the leverage? Clara thrived. She built a small elite team, recruiting 2 other linguists with similar backgrounds in law and finance. They became Blackwood's secret weapon. They analyzed corporate communications, parsed the nuances of political speeches, and created detailed linguistic profiles of key negotiation targets. They could predict a company's sticking points by the way they used conditional clauses in their press releases, or identify a CEO's hidden insecurities by the metaphors he favored in interviews. It was a fusion of art and science, and it gave Blackwood an unprecedented edge. Her relationship with Sterling Blackwood evolved into a complex professional symbiosis. The hierarchy was still absolute. He was the boss. She was his subordinate, but the dynamic had changed. He no longer treated her like an asset to be deployed, but like a trusted advisor. Their conversations were sharp, efficient, and focused entirely on the work. He would challenge her assumptions, pushing her to find deeper layers of meaning, and she, in turn, was one of the few people in the company who was not afraid to tell him he was wrong. "Your interpretation of that Japanese quarterly report is too literal, sir," she told him during one late-night session. "The repeated use of the phrase forward-looking isn't a sign of confidence. In this context, it's a classic example of corporate face-saving. They're signaling a poor upcoming quarter without explicitly stating it. We should delay our acquisition offer." Blackwood had argued, but she held her ground, walking him through the cultural and linguistic precedents. He eventually grudgingly conceded. 3 weeks later, the Japanese company's stock plummeted after a disastrous earnings call. Blackwood Capital swept in and acquired them for 30% less than their initial offer. He never explicitly said, "You were right," but the next day, a rare bottle of Japanese whiskey was delivered to her office with a simple unsigned note that read, "Point taken." The money, once the sole object of her struggles, became an abstract figure on a bank statement. She paid off the last of her father's medical debts with a single-wire transfer, an act that felt so momentous and yet so quiet. She moved out of her tiny flat and into a modern apartment overlooking a quiet London square. She bought her father now, in stable health and retirement, a small cottage by the sea, a dream he had spoken of for years. She was rebuilding her family's foundation, not with bricks and mortar, but with verbs and vowels. Yet a part of her remained unsettled. She had succeeded in a world she once despised. She worked side by side with a man whose initial cruelty had been the catalyst for her new life. Could she ever truly reconcile those two facts? Was she simply a well-paid cog in a machine of ruthless capitalism, a machine driven by a man like Blackwood? The answer came from an unexpected source. Anton Petrov returned to London 6 months after the initial deal was signed to finalize the second phase of the project. A dinner was arranged not at Ethelgard's, but at another equally exclusive restaurant. This time Clara was not serving the table. She was seated at it directly to Blackwood's right. Petrov greeted her warmly, a genuine smile on his face. "Miss Vance, the strategist, it is a pleasure to see you again. I trust Sterling is treating you well. He is lucky to have you." "Mr. Petrov," Clara replied, smiling back. "It's good to see you too. And yes, the work is very rewarding." Throughout the dinner, Clara was an active participant. She clarified points of the contract in Russian, for Petrov discussed the political climate in English with Blackwood and proved to be as adept at dinner-table diplomacy as she was at contractual analysis. Later in the evening, while Blackwood was occupied with a phone call, Petrov leaned toward her. "He is a difficult man, Sterling," he said quietly, his voice laced with the wisdom of someone who had known Blackwood for years. "He sees the world as a series of problems to be solved, of assets to be acquired. He does not understand people well. He understands leverage." He swirled the wine in his glass. "That night at the restaurant, you did not just show him your skill. You showed him a different kind of strength. Not of money, but of character. He is a man who respects only strength. You forced him to respect you. And in doing so, I think you may have changed him. A little." Clara looked across the room at Blackwood, who was speaking into his phone with his usual sharp, commanding tone. Had she changed him, she doubted it. But perhaps she had opened a door in his mind, shown him that value could be found in the most unexpected places, that a person's worth was not defined by their station. As the dinner concluded and they stood to leave, Blackwood helped Clara with her coat. It was a simple common courtesy, but from him it felt significant. As they walked out into the cool London night, he paused by the valet. "I never asked Miss Vance," he said, his tone uncharacteristically hesitant. "Your father, you said you left Oxford to care for him. Is he well?" The question was so unexpected, so personal, that it caught Clara completely off guard. In all their time working together, he had never once ventured into her personal life. "He is," she said, surprised by the warmth in her own voice. "He's retired, living by the sea. He's happy. Thank you for asking." Blackwood just nodded, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. "Good," he said simply. He turned his attention back to the arriving car, the moment of personal connection, vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. But it had happened. It was a tiny crack in the armor, a brief glimpse of the man behind the Titan. Anton Petrov was right. Maybe she hadn't changed him, but she had undeniably made a mark. Walking home through the quiet streets of Mayfair, Clara realized that her new life wasn't a betrayal of her old self. It was a reclaiming of it. She hadn't become a part of Blackwood's world so much as she had forced his world to make a space for hers. She wasn't just his head of linguistic strategy. She was the woman who had translated his arrogance into an opportunity, and in doing so had written a new chapter for them both. 1 year to the day after the dinner at Ethelgard's, Clara stood by the window of her corner office. The title on her door now read, Partner Global Strategy. Her small team had become the nerve center for the firm's international operations, and her relationship with Sterling Blackwood had settled into a rhythm of deep, mutual respect. She was no longer just his advisor. She was his equal. That afternoon, an elegant envelope appeared on her desk. Inside were 2 tickets to that evening's performance of the Royal Philharmonic Orchestra, a program of Russian composers. It was a gesture so uncharacteristically thoughtful, she knew immediately who it was from. As she was preparing to leave, Sterling appeared at her door dressed in a dinner jacket. "Clara," he said the first time he had used her name. "I trust the tickets are acceptable." "They are," she replied, a small smile on her lips. "Thank you, Sterling." He looked out at the glittering city. "I find," he said, his voice quiet, "that after a year of deconstructing language for profit, it's refreshing to simply experience it as art." It was the closest he would ever come to an apology, a recognition of the journey that began with a cruel joke and now culminated in a shared appreciation of art. They walked out of the silent office building together. A year ago, she had been a waitress leaving through a service entrance. Tonight, she was a partner on her way to the symphony. As the soaring notes of Tchaikovsky filled the concert hall, Clara knew she had finally found a language that was entirely her own. It was a language of resilience, of intellect, and of a quiet, unshakable dignity that no one in any tongue could ever diminish again. Clara Vance's story is a powerful reminder that we should never judge a book by its cover or a person by their uniform. True worth isn't measured in bank accounts, but in skill integrity and the courage to stand up for oneself when you are most vulnerable. The world is full of hidden talents, of brilliant minds, in unexpected places, waiting for a single moment to shine. The next time you encounter someone in the service industry, remember the unseen life and the untapped potential they might possess. What did you think of Sterling Blackwood's transformation? Was Clara right to accept his offer and work for a man who had so casually disrespected her? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story of triumph and unexpected turns, please smash that like button, share it with a friend who needs a dose of inspiration, and subscribe for more real-life dramas that will keep you on the edge of your seat.